That everybody see that?
No. Hmm.
Right. Didn't share. And there we go. How's that?
Awesome. Yes, I can see that.
Okay. Well, thanks everybody for joining in today. Again, my name's Todd Rexine. I'm the conservation director at Great River Greening. Um, and I'll just give you a brief introduction about who I am and who Great River Greening is, and then continue on to talk about our biochar initiative. Gray River Greening itself, we're a 501(c)(3) nonprofit organization. We're focused on natural resource restoration in Minnesota. We began in 1995 just as a project of the city of St. Paul, and since then we've grown to expand across the state of Minnesota, working with various landowning entities and some private land managers to help affect natural resource management on the landscape. With that, we're primarily focused on restoration of prairies, oak savannas, as well as forested areas. And then we also do work with our agricultural partners to talk about continuous living cover crops in the landscape, as well as silvopasture, which is getting grazing animals back into the landscape and getting them back into forested areas. Um, And with that, myself, I'm Todd Rexine. I'm the conservation director here at Great River Greening. I oversee our whole entire conservation side of the organization, everything from our grant funding to doing the work on the ground to working with our crew and technician to bring them up to speed on projects we're doing across the state. And I took on our biochar initiative about 3 years ago. It fell underneath me, and I'm the one that's been promoting it across the state, working to build partnerships across the state, educate people about biochar, and figure out how biochar fits it within the natural resources realm. As part of that, I've also, in the last several years, became a founding member of the Minnesota Biochar Initiative. I also work with our Bureau of Water Resources on a biochar collaboration, and also work with the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency as part of a wood waste stakeholders group. And again, this presentation on our end wouldn't be possible with, again, financial support from various funders, Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund, Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, Clean Water, Land and Legacy, and Centerpoint Energy Foundation. And with that, we'll dive into how our biochar initiative got started here in Minnesota. Um, Biggest issue, again, we hire contractors across the state. We typically have about 120 different projects going on across the state at any given time. And what's part of that process of natural resource restoration is we have a lot of wood that we need to deal with, whether it's dealing with invasive species management. We have a lot of buckthorn, Rhamnus cathartica, that invades our forested areas as well as our savannas and prairies. There's a lot of that, taking that off. We have a lot of land that's just not been managed. There's usually some sort of timber thinning that has to happen on land to get it back to a manageable state. And then we also have just dead wood that we need to take care of to get it restored. And part of that process of getting the natural wood off is, what do you do with all that wood waste? What do you do with it at the end? And up until 2017, there was a program in Minnesota where we had some larger biofuel plants, and we could consolidate wooded material on a site. It could get chipped, it gets sent off, and it would be burned for energy, processed for energy. Uh, Around 2017, 2018, as solar and wind started to have better subsidies in them, and our larger biofuel plants started to close down. With that, we do still have one biofuel plant in St. Paul that still operates and provides some electricity in downtown St. Paul. And we do have at least one or two county co-op biofuel systems across the state that still take biofuel wood waste. But with with that closure of those larger plants, a lot of our contractors we started work with, we have to get that wood off the land, and they start turning back to brush piles. So we saw brush piles decrease, and now all of a sudden with those closures of those larger plants, we started to see brush piles getting back on the landscape. And that's fine. That's a way to get rid of the wood. But as an organization, we started having questions. What is all these brush piles doing to the environment? Now, they're releasing all this carbon up in the atmosphere in a time when we're dealing with climate change and warming winters here across the state and then across the country. But then we're also got ramifications of the soil itself. We're restoring the land, but we're also degrading the soil underneath it, scarring the soil. It's a living organism that now we've scarred, we scarified. And we go back to sites 2, 5, 10 years later, and we can still find those burn scars. And the only things we're really finding that grow in there are thistles and weedy species. And there's still pretty sparse areas where native vegetation is not reestablishing. Also, to say around that time, we also saw an increased contractors looking at mowing the forest down too. So we have a thick giant stand of buckthorn or invasive species. It's easier for them getting a skid steer with a forestry mower and just mow the whole site down, which is fine. But we also are back to the same problem. Now we have all this wood waste still in the land, and it's decomposing and releasing methane as part of the decomposition process. And then we also have all these nice little critters on the right-hand side of the screen that are also causing issues. And Minnesota is just getting up to speed with emerald ash borer. We now have emerald ash borer pretty much in every single state or in every single county in Minnesota. We also have spruce budworm in the northern forest going after our balsam fir and our scotch and our balsam and our other plants up there. And then we have Asian longhorn beetle, which is going after our pine trees. And so we're getting a glut of wood waste in the system in Minnesota. So again, the issue, and on the left-hand side of the screen, that's a buckthorn in a oak woodland. That's what it looked like before. And this is just to kind of show a before and after contrast. And a lot of times when we talk to land managers and they're unfamiliar with the things we're dealing with or just general public, green looks good in most people's mind. But as an ecologist, I'm looking at that, I'm seeing that that's not a high diversity. There's not a lot of habitat there for wildlife. And so we worked with this, in this particular case, we worked with this Dakota County in Minnesota here, 240-acre restoration. It was over 5 years to get it to the picture on the right, which is managing the buckthorn out of the system. And just another example here, we have a fen site, and this is now, this site is probably 10, 15 years ago. And this is before we even thought about biochar. We weren't thinking about what we're doing to the site itself with burning these piles. But this is just to give you an idea, 20 acres, all buckthorn, Rhamnus cathartica, about 750 cubic yards of brush. And that was all burnt in burn piles across the whole entire site because we weren't able to get in there and get it off the site. And just to give you an idea, it's about 112.5 tons or the equivalent weight of 19 adult elephants. So we have all these issues. We need to figure out a solution. Staff, myself, and at that time, there's just 3 other staff here at the organization. We all sat down and decided we need to figure out some other way to work with contractors and educate the general public about how do we work with biochar or how do we work with all this wood waste. And that's when we started doing a lot of research. And we settled on flame cap kilns as a way to process this material on site. And start turning it into biochar and actually turning it into something, locking up the carbon. And then if we don't have a use for that biochar, we can spread it back on site. And so what did this look like for us? And it was how are we going to figure this out? So we had to figure out that we need to figure out how to get kilns into Minnesota. There were no kilns. No one had kilns in Minnesota. No one really understood biochar on site practices. We had asked around and made phone calls out west to all the individuals out there that are doing it to learn from them. But then what does a program and initiative look like? And we settled on a couple different factors. We need to get our staff up to speed on what biochar is and how to process and use these kilns. We need to figure out the equipment side of it. Um, we also need to get demonstrations and start talking to our service providers, training service providers up so they understand how to use kilns on sites, how to properly use them, and not just use them as a way to burn wood, but actually you're producing biochar. And then start talking to permitting agencies, and then how do we disseminate this information across the state and outside the state now. And honestly, at the beginning, I'm going to say we were really naive. We didn't fully, we just thought this is a way to reduce wood waste. Biochar is good. And have come a long way. We've learned a lot along the way. We've talked to a lot of people, got a lot more information. We get a lot of questions as well. And the biggest one is, great, we have this idea. This is what we need to do. How do we fund this? How do we figure out how to implement this biochar initiative in the state of Minnesota? And at first, we put together in 2021, we started to write grants to one of our state funding agencies, Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund, which allows for things that are not just focused on restoration, but new restoration techniques. We also applied to various foundations. We're kind of throwing a broad net to figure out how we could figure out how to get funding to help get our staff to learn how to do this and then train others. And in 2021, we did that application process and we got turned down. We didn't get any funding. We didn't get any feedback either. So we reconvened in 2022 and basically started calling around and finding out from people that sat on those various councils and those boards what they knew about biochar. And we found out is no one knew what biochar was. And so we doubled down and started having conversations with council members on at least for Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund and started educating them about biochar. We called half the council members, and then that half of the council members talked to others, and we were successful in getting our first grant to start implementing biochar on site practices and education in the state of Minnesota. And our first step was we got to figure out the equipment that we need to do this. We're a bunch of natural resources folks. We know how to do prescribed fire. We've got training in prescribed fire. We know how to do burn piles. How do we take that equipment that we normally use for those activities and figure out how to adapt it to working with biochar kilns? And it pretty much there's a lot of stuff that's similar. We still are able to use a Type 3 engine, which is a 350 gallons roughly in the back of a truck. We're able to use our hand tools, our McLeods, our shovels that we use for fireline. Some of the stuff we had to adjust for, we usually don't use a thermometer, but we had to figure out how we're going to keep track of how hot these kilns are. So using infrared thermometers and probes to track the temperature of the kilns to make sure we're getting it up to temp. Also new to all of our staff is figuring out that we had to go out and take moisture readings on this wood. When we do brush piles that normally you throw the wood in and you just burn it, you're not concerned about how moist it is because you got enough dead wood that you mix it all together and burn it. And then looking at different ways to ignition. And if you watch videos, a lot of people will use a combination of either a drip torch, which is used in prescribed fire for starting brush for doing prescribed fires. But also the other one that we found very successful is we started using what's called a weed dragon. It's a long wand that you hook up to a propane tank, and we can just let it sit there and get the kiln going. And then also looking at welding gear. We're dealing with high temperatures, so looking at how can we use welding smocks and welding gloves to help protect ourselves while we're doing it. And then our approach as far as the kiln side, everybody asks, how come you went with flame capped versus air curtain versus this versus that? And originally we settled on just looking at Oregon and ring of fire kilns. Primarily what we're looking at was we were looking for the size. They were simple, they were small. It allowed us not a lot of equipment we can get out there. You can hand load these kilns. We also looked at the big box, and we have a couple big boxes now, but we were looking at low technology things that we did not have to do a lot of training on. That's essentially why we didn't go with, we had looked at the air curtain burner side of stuff, looking at a char boss, and realized if we were going to have contractors use this, we need something that's low tech. We don't have to be out there all the time training them how to use a piece of equipment. And for those, I just have a couple pictures of the Oregon kiln, the Ring of Fire, and big box for those that aren't familiar with them. Oregon kiln, great size. It's a nice size for landowners, for private landowners, especially if they can hook it up to a UTV and drag it around. It does have the one problem with it is they weigh 300 pounds. So in order to get this kiln around, you need 2 to 3 people to move it around. It doesn't come apart. It's the size of a small dumpster, but it does work really well. It has a drain plug on it that you can pull out when you quench, lets the water out, and then 2 people can easily tip this over and flip it. The other kiln we went with was a Ring of Fire kiln. These are, for those of you that are familiar, this is Kelpie Wilson's design. And we've been very happy with this design. It took a learning curve with us as well as land managers to educate because of the fact it doesn't have a bottom. And everybody's concerned about scarifying the soil. And we found successfully as we build that char up inside the kiln, it builds up an insulation to the ground, and we don't have the scarification. We're not burning the soil itself. It does take some assembly, but these, you break this down, this fits in the back of a pickup truck really well. Um, and it's also modular. We've started playing with the size of it lately. Standard setup is 5 cubic yards. It's a 6 panel kiln. We've started playing with an 8 panel kiln, which gets us up to 10 cubic yards. Um, we've even gone as big as a 12 cubic yard one, or 12 panel one. That started getting a little out of hand with the temperature wise, but it is manageable if you have the water resources to do it. But you're looking at almost 22 cubic yards by the time you put 2 Ring of Fires together. And then the last kiln that we started looking into, and we now have a couple of these, is the big box kiln. This is out of a design out of Utah State. Um, and we got the plans. It's an open source design, got it in, got it welded, made one originally, and then went in and played with it and toyed with it and made some changes to it, and got ourselves 3 of these now. But this with this kiln, you have to have a piece of equipment to load it and to empty it. The kiln itself weighs 1,800 pounds fully, and when it's fully loaded, you're 3,200 pounds plus. So you kind of have to have a toss up of what you have for equipment to use these kilns and what the resources you have on site. So that was our approach with the kilns, is we really went with the flame cap system, and we've been very happy with it. Next was figuring out the permitting situation. Like I said, no one was familiar with biochar in Minnesota, let alone these, what they called big giant bonfire pits. And so it was reaching out to the DNR. DNR was very accepting of it. They help run the state permitting across the state. And the big one was getting over the idea that, and that, knowing different states, in Minnesota, if you have 4 inches of snow cover in the winter, you don't need a burn permit, you don't need a variance, you can just go out and light up. But we're proposing with these kilns, we can burn outside of that, and we can burn safely outside of that without having to worry about igniting the fine fuels around it. And that took a little bit more convincing. And once we got that convincing with the DNR, it helped us go a long way to helping talk with the local fire marshals, especially in the Minneapolis, St. Paul area and some of the more metropolitan areas where the fire marshals are the ones that control the permitting, versus the DNR. And then as anything with any of this is documentation. We wrote in here that we're going to document everything that we're doing. We're going to treat this as if we're doing a prescribed fire. We're going to take all the weather conditions. We're going to track relative humidity, the wind speed direction. We want to know what the feedstock composition is, what kiln type are we deploying that day? What's the temperature 1 hour in of the kiln? What's it 2 hours in? What's the temperature before we quench? And any other notes that we can have so that if we have any deviations in the quality of the biochar, we can look back to our notes and figure out why there might have been, and we can draw some conclusions. Um, and this is essentially what a tracking sheet in our system. We just have a big giant Excel spreadsheet, um, and everything goes into there. Depend as much information as we can get in there, even if it's a contractor or a rental. We try to get as much information that we can to see what the quality is. Because what we're also doing on this documentation is we're collecting samples as we go and we're sending them out to get processed and find out what the carbon percentage is, find out what the hydrogen to carbon ratio is, so we know what quality biochar we're actually able to produce in these kilns. And I can say, in our first year, we had a lower carbon percentage. We were about 78.6% carbon. Now, anything between 50 to 90% carbon is biochar, but we're trying to make sure we have a higher quality biochar. Our hydrogen to carbon ratio was 0.39. Anything under zero point 0.4, you want to be under zero point 0.7. So we're good with 0.39. We thought we could do better. But anything under zero point 0.4 is considered highly stable carbon in the environment. Last year's metrics came in, we were averaging about 82.6% carbon. So we're getting better carbon quality, better carbon retention in our biochar. And we also were able to get that hydrogen to carbon ratio down to 0.32. So we're getting even a more stable carbon. And that just happens to come with staff knowing how to watch the kilns, knowing what to watch for when they're feeding the kilns, and understanding the temperatures that they're dealing with. And with that, you know, talk about documentation, but we got to learn how to do it. And so this is getting out with staff. In this case, we also did work with some volunteers to help us sort the wood, but we had to sort the wood, get it sorted by size, figure out, and then also start taking moisture readings of it and make sure it's dry enough. And what we found in Minnesota probably applies similar to Michigan and other Midwest states is it's a lot longer drying cycle in the upper Midwest than it is out west. If you read a lot of the articles from out west, they say the drying time is around 30 days. We're finding in Minnesota with an RH of, on a dry day here, an RH is 40. We're finding the drying time is roughly 60 to 90 days in drying temperatures. So, in drying temperatures, I mean, it's not that you cut the stuff in January and think you can go in March. We haven't had a drying cycle, but once April comes around, the clock starts ticking. We got 60 to 90 days of drying time, with the wood on the landscape at that point, which is all stuff that has to be taken into account when you start planning on how you're going to do biochar, for these sites. And then I'm going to run through kind of what it looks like for those on the call. I want to make sure everybody understands what the loading process is of it. And this is what the stuff we had to learn. How do you load a kiln? Well, you need to load the kiln. You don't pack it. We made that mistake. We packed it in there and we couldn't figure out why we had so much smoke. So it's a loose pack in there. Build a rick, 1 inch diameter and smaller, and just fill that kiln full, and then get in there and ignite it. And we can see here, these are two ring of fire kilns. Usually we can get started with one torch. If we want to get it started faster, we'll fire up 2 torches and get it going even faster. And I should say also on the ignition side, from trial and error, is there's a tendency to light the bottom of the kiln. You really want to light that top. You want that fire on top of the kiln. You don't want it to fall down at the bottom, because now you just built a bonfire again. So flip that fire cycle upside down, light the top, let it burn down, and then feeding up and keeping that fire on top. And that leads you into the processing and feeding. And I throw these in here also just to show, because sometimes you don't get to see really the flame lengths. And that's the other part about this is we were surprised by the flame lengths on these kilns when we use them. We're getting flame lengths sometimes 10, 13 feet above the top of the kiln, which leads you to how do you site the kiln properly? Make sure there's nothing overhead that's going to possibly ignite, because we're doing this in forested areas sometimes. And with oak trees that don't lose their leaves, we got to watch out for that as well because we could ignite the oak leaves. And then figuring out just again how to load it. We've used the kilns, even the small kiln, the ring of fire. We've rented a small skid steer with a brush grapple to help just move wood around and load as well. And then watching and training, there's a lot of pictures here with other people in them. Again, we're doing these demonstrations as well, so we can have those conversations that, hey, this Oregon kiln is at that point, we got that white ash on top. It's now we're going to let the flames die down and we're going to be ready to quench. And going out teaching our staff on how to quench in different cycles, teaching them how to quench with snow in freezing conditions. Both of these other two were pouring water on the Oregon that it was 25 degrees outside. So we're dipping 5-gallon pails inside the back of our tank and pulling it out to put these out. And then what does it look like to quench these kilns, these larger kilns? This was an 8-panel kiln. In a warm, this was last fall actually, and getting in there and showing people how to quench it properly. And so then, well, after we learn all that and we've taught our staff, it's now we got to hit the road. We took us about a year to get all of our staff up to speed on how to run kilns, what it looks like, how do we need to stack the material. We've switched some of our techniques for stacking. If we're doing a buckthorn or an invasive species site where it's smaller diameter material, we will stack the wood differently than what a lot of the literature out there says. We don't pre-sort it. We stack it, cut ends on one side, brush ends on the other, and then we'll run through with the chainsaw and we'll cut at 4-foot or 5-foot intervals, depending on the size of the kiln. And if we can do that cut end versus bushy end, we know the bushy end's the small stuff. Middle of that log is somewhere around our middle size, and then we have our bigger stuff on the end. And what that has allowed us to do is save time and money with contractors on site that they're not sorting the wood. They can push that chainsaw through and they know where to pick from. They can just grab from those parts of the piles. And then it's getting out and demonstrating all that knowledge in how to do it on the landscape. We hold about 6 to 12 trainings and demonstrations a year across the state of Minnesota. We're not focusing on the public sector. We're focusing really on professionals. We want to talk to the fire professionals, our fire marshals, um, prescribed prescribed fire staff. We want to talk to land managers, government staff, state, federal, local, conservation staff, but get everybody together who possibly could be dealing with wood waste and natural resources and train them on the process, talk to them about the process, and help them through the process as well. I also have on here ag professionals. I can tell you right now, at the beginning, when we started our biochar initiative, agricultural professionals were not on our radar. But after we started having some silvopasture discussions, again, silvopasture being getting grazing animals back in forested lands, we started realizing there was a need for agriculture farmers that were asking us questions. What do you do with all this wood? If you're going to go in, I have that back 40 that I'm going to put cattle back on. I need to clear out the buckthorn. I need to thin out the forest for cattle. What do I do with all that wood waste? And we started talking to them more and more about biochar, and that now has become something we also talk with farmers about is if you are going to do this, there's another way to look at processing it, and you get carbon at the end of it that you can put back into your soil, provided you get it tested, and that falls in line with the NRCS 336 standard, which is soil amendments for agricultural professionals. And then it's also part of this demonstration is we have kilns available in the system now through this grant process. So when others reach out to us, they want to try a kiln, we can get a kiln out there. We can have staff that can go out there and work with their staff to train them on how to use biochar kilns. We've had several counties and cities that before they put the money into investing in whether it's a ring of fire or an Oregon kiln. They can try one out for a couple of days. They can figure out if it's right, what size is right for their application. And then we've also even had some entities that just reach other like, we just bought a ring of fire. We don't know what to do with it. How do you put it together? We're a resource within the state that we either call them up on the phone if it's too far to drive, we talk them through it. Um, the other part is we send staff out if they're within drivable distance, so we can send a staff member out and just work with them for a couple hours to get them up and going so that they are doing it properly. They have the right process in mind when they do it. And then the other part about education and demonstration is you got to get contractors out there to do it. We can't do it alone. We're just a small nonprofit that we affect some land, but we really need our contractors and service providers to get up and get up to speed on how to process this wood waste. Um, so we've had several sites where we've got contractors out working with Ring of Fires, big box kilns. Their feedback to us is the bigger the kiln, the better. They don't like the Oregon kilns, primarily just because of the size. They want to be able to process the 5, 10 cubic yards at a time. Um, and then also what we're asking of our contractors is that data sheet that I showed at the beginning is we want them to turn that back into us. We want to have the same data that we collect on our staff doing it. We want our contractors to be using that same data, the same sheet, so we can track on how they're doing it. We also go out and test. And that's the one thing we're finding is across 6 contractors that we had last year, we're finding a lower, their carbon range, percent of carbon in their biochar is ranging from 50 to 85%. So we have a huge span of what quality of biochar we're getting from contractors, as well as their carbon to hydrogen ratio is varying from 0.42 to 0.6. Again, it's still under that 0.7. It's stable. We'd like to see them to get to the highly stable side. And what we're figuring out is contractors are out there to make money, and they're going to feed that kiln as fast as possible so they can get as much material burnt in a cycle as possible. And we need to teach them on how to, they need to step back a little bit. They need to let those kilns cycle, and they need to let those kilns get up to heat. If you get the kilns up to hot, if you get the kilns up hot enough, it's going to eat the wood. It's going to process that wood, but it's just re-educating our service providers on this is a different method than just doing our prescribed fire or pile burns. And then we're asking everybody we're asking them for feedback, especially the contractors and our egg producers. Again, like I said here, they want to be able to process larger volumes. Um, they look at the biochar implementation as a risk to them. They're not familiar with it. It's a new process, and they're still hesitant to bid on it. We're getting higher bids. So how we get around that is we ask them for a bid. I want you to process biochar for 2 days, wood waste for 2 days on a site. I'm not going to pay you to do all of it. I just want you to do it for 2 days or 3 days. Give me a number for 3 staff to be out there with 2 to 3 kilns, and let's figure that out first. And we've been having good success with that with contractors as their staff start to learn how to process biochar into these kilns. They're starting to get more comfortable with it, and they start to understand it more. And there's an aha moment where they're like, we could have used this on this site, or we could have used it on this site, just from a fire safety standpoint. And then also talking to our contractors and service providers about expectations. What do we expect at the end of it? Um, it's different. We don't want a big pile. I don't want just ash. I want a pile of biochar at the end. And what are we going to do with that biochar at the end? Um, the other side is we heard from, and I mentioned a little bit in here, but we did hear people are interested in renting. They may only need it for one thing. And so let's look at how we can get rental access. And with that is how do we look at the cost of delivery? We're located in St. Paul. A lot of, if we have farmers that want to use it, farmers are almost 2 to 3 hours drive away from this, out of St. Paul. How do we figure out ways to get kilns to people that need them in an economic manner that is fitting with them, is feasible for them? And we've started also playing around with localizing hubs. We just set up one up in Little Falls. So that's about from St. Paul. It's about an hour and a half north. But we have a partner up there who is willing for us to house a couple of kilns up there. And then we can start working with them to run a rental kiln service out there, which means we're starting to break down some of those barriers for agricultural process people that use farming, as well as some of our forestry members up there that work out of that area and live in that area. Um, as far as renting with to our service providers, a lot of our service providers live within a half hour or operate within a half hour of the St. Paul region. So when our service providers ask for a kiln, we're able to usually get one to them pretty efficiently. And then the other side, a lot of contractors are asking us, what does biochar on site look like at scale? What happens if we cut 30 acres of buckthorn or invasive species or wood waste? What does that look like? How long would that take us to get through that? Which is a good question. And that's one that we're trying to figure out how to look at funding. Like, how can we fund a property, one project with a large amount of wood waste, and just have a contractor go through the motions of processing that? And what does that cost look like? So just to kind of sum some things up internally, it was us getting, looking at getting flame cap kilns into Minnesota. We did that. We now have 7 Oregons, 7 Ring of Fires, and 3 big boxes. Get internal training to all of our staff. Work on data collection inside. That's ongoing. Um, Externally, it's continuing. It's continued engagement of people outside the organization and continue to get more people trained or understanding what the biochar process is. And that's in the silvopasture, that's in the natural systems management. That's also working with our local NRCS offices to get them to understand that this is an option that farmers can look into. And then figure out what the new sectors are in the region that we can work with. We recently just worked with U.S. Forest Service up in Superior National Forest last winter on a demonstration up there, and starting to make inroads up there with some of the Firewise communities, and how can we look at Firewise communities as a possibility for use of kilns to help reduce wood waste and fire and fuels reduction on the landscape. And then getting into dissemination, we got the kiln access. We've got that up and going. We're working through disseminating findings on our website and through networks. Continue to do demonstrations and presentations. While one grant is going off, we have our trust fund grant is ending this year. We were successful in getting a wood waste grant from the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. That's also going to allow us to go for another year and a half beyond our trust fund grant. So one grant will roll off. We'll still have another year and a half to continue to do more demonstrations. And then the other one we're working with, and I know entities have done it, but we're looking for volunteer. How do we incorporate this into volunteer events? We used to do brush piles with volunteers. How do we look at these kilns and figure out a safe way for members of the public to work with us in volunteering and helping us feed these kilns, as well as educating them on the process? And so some outcomes since 2023. And this is data up through December of last year. We facilitated 202 cubic yards of biochar. That's through rentals, that's through demonstrations, that's through our staff doing it themselves, it's through hiring contractors to do it. Um, so 202 cubic yards since 2023, 164 cubic yards of that was done last year. And just to give you an idea, that breaks down to about 823 cubic yards of wood waste from natural resource management that was sitting on the landscape that probably would have just been burned in brush piles. We've engaged with over 500 people in public settings, as well as trainings and demonstrations. The other part that we're working on, as well as with the biochar initiative, is I talked about the specification. I talked about best practices out west. They talk about 30 days of drying. We're working on creating um, best management practices for Minnesota and the upper Midwest. Those should be out within the next month. We worked in drafting it, but it's all based on our experience on the landscape. Some of the stuff is the same as what you do in other parts. Others are, the drying conditions are different. Some of the stacking that we talked about with just stacking and putting a chainsaw through it versus stacking in different size piles. The other part is we're also, because we do hire contractors, we spent a lot of time working with contractors, hired contractors to do buckthorn biochar based on specifications. Things didn't go right. What didn't go right with the specifications? So we rewrote the specifications. And so also on our website, eventually hopefully within the next month, we're gonna have a specification document. So if you're gonna hire a contractor, here's a starting point at least. Though you're gonna have to change it by site, but how do you change if you already have a starting point? Let's get the specifications up there for you so people can use those. And we started discerning that out to some of our county and city staff as well, partners that have talked to us. And so yeah, what's next? It's kind of continuing on as we have been. We're let's get out statewide in Minnesota and continue doing demos, trainings, presentations. Figure out the holes in our kiln rental assistance. We got some funding from Pollution Control Agency in there. We have funding to help offset delivery costs. So if I'm going to drive 2 hours, I can cover that with some grant funds to help cover the cost of me getting a kiln out to you. Um, we're focusing more discussions with egg producers and how they can incorporate biochar into their planning, and then continue to work with interested land managers to process biochar. So it's a lot of following up. After we have a demonstration, it's following up with the landowning managers to see what else, what other questions do they have? How can we work together? How can we partner together? Do you need a kiln to borrow? And then we've also started looking at neighboring states. Currently, all of our funding is from various Minnesota funding sources that go to natural resources or from Pollution Control Agency. And we've had a lot of interest from bordering counties in South Dakota of farmers that are interested in it, as well as we've had a lot of interest in Wisconsin from both natural resources as well as egg producers there. And we're looking to figure out how we can break down that barrier. We've got the trucks, we've got the kilns. How do we get across the borders and be able to cover our time to get across and help people expand the knowledge of biochar on site? And with that, I'm open for questions. I think I did. Yeah, tried to leave 15 minutes here for questions at the end here. So
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much, Todd. If you have any questions, go ahead and put them in the chat and I will read them out loud to Todd. If we run out of time, Todd had his email information on
I'll get
that
that
last
back up.
slide. Yeah,
Let me
I'm
get
just
that
gonna put
back up.
that. Yeah, no problem. And then you'll know how to contact him directly.
Yep.
So
Yeah,
just
and
a
there,
few things that, oh,
I was
sorry,
just,
go ahead, Todd.
I was gonna say the QR code there also, if you have a phone, you can take a picture of the QR code. It's a virtual business card as well.
Um, Okay, so just a couple things that came through while you were talking from Aaron LeDuc. Are you working with any golf courses?
We are not currently working with golf courses, but it's on our radar. We had applied for a project last year to work with a golf course. We just didn't get the project, and biochar was written into it as part of the process. Um, and that's part of the other part is we're trying to educate people how could biochar be used in your soil, and that's the other part of the barrier that we're trying to work on too, which I think there's a possibility there for golf courses with biochar.
Okay, and a comment from Karina Stark. The contractor training slash familiarity approach and learning curve lines up exactly with what we're seeing in Washington.
Good. And hi, Karina.
All right. Any other questions? Aaron raised his hand. Go ahead, Aaron. You can unmute yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Sorry, you might have already said it. I kind of missed it, but are you guys working with any golf courses at all?
Not at the moment, we're not. We had a golf course that had some woody removal that was needed, and we had pitched biochar as a possibility for dealing with that. Unfortunately, we didn't get the project, but I there's something there, I think, with golf courses. I think there's a lot of applications for how to work biochar in, whether it's the processing side or even just as a soil amendment on the site. But yes, we
So,
haven't moved for the golf course yet.
so I talked to Jim Doughton, and he's definitely on board with trying to kind of go that route as far as Michigan goes, I think is where he's at, right? Or is it still Minnesota? I'm not
Uh,
sure.
Jim is in Minneapolis, so he's in Minnesota. Yeah.
Okay, gotcha. And then I was just at a turf grass conference in Colorado just past December. And so there's a company called Air G to G where they've got a machine that they come in and basically drill sand. And then they're starting to mix some of their profiles with one of the bigger companies in the industry, like Profile Sand Products, I think it is. So they're starting to see some pretty good results from that for sure. So it's definitely starting to work its way in.
Yeah.
Definitely appreciate what you guys are doing. So.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. And I should say it, I did cover the side of this that biochar is making its way into other parts of our organization. We have a whole urban tree planting program that is also on our conservation side. And with land managers not knowing what to do with the biochar when we do these demonstrations, we start taking the biochar with us. And we're now starting to incorporate that into our urban tree planting program. So if they are not going to use it, we ask them for the right to take, 100 gallons. So we'll fill up a horse trough of biochar, take it back. And we now, I think, sitting in our shop right now, we have about 3 cubic yards of amended biochar. So biochar and compost, 1-to-1 ratio, and it's going to go into urban tree plantings starting here in a couple months. Um, we've been letting it sit for the last couple months inside a garage, keeping it moist so that the microbes and everything come to balance. And we're going to see how that works. We've now planted 2 years of trees without that amendment. We're going to start putting it in. The soils for those that do tree plant, urban soils are horrible. There's not much. They've been so moved around, they're compacted, and we're hoping that this will help with our tree survival rate.
Awesome.
Thanks, Aaron. Okay, next question. Does the amount of biochar produced create a reasonable amount to be returned to the site or used in on-site stormwater management features? Or is the amount too great?
I think it depends on the quantity of material you're doing. We did do a 4-acre site of buckthorn last year with a county park system. They wanted a demonstration to see what it would take. A volunteer had been working on 4 acres for years, and the forestry manager didn't realize that they had done this. And he came across 4 acres of cleared buckthorn and wood waste. And we pulled off of that site of 4 acres. I'm doing the math in my head. It was about 40 cubic yards of biochar. It was 2 days out there processing. That site, we weren't going to spread it back on, but we worked with the land manager. They're going to actually take that. They have an in-house nursery that they're going to pull all that biochar off and start using it as a soil amendment in their nursery stock trade. I do think there is possibilities to figure out how to use this for stormwater management applications if you're not going to put it back on the site. We're also talking with some natural resource professionals about and research and do a research plot of what is the effects of putting raw biochar back onto a site that has a buckthorn infestation. There's a lot of discussion that people feel that buckthorn might be a nitrophile, that it needs higher nitrogen soils to grow and that thrive in. And if we put that raw char back on a site like that at different, figure out test plots, whether it's 2 or 3 different test plots, is there a sweet spot that if we put that back on, that it starts to pull some of that nitrogen out of the soil and starts to impact the invasive species that rely on nitrogen soils? higher nitrogen soils than our native species, which we do know that the native species don't need the higher nitrogen soils. So there's applications there, but it is something that we are looking at how to talk to watershed districts and that around that. If we're processing biochar, the site doesn't need it. Is there a way to get it to one of our watershed districts or soil and water conservation districts that then they could incorporate it into stormwater management practices, or put it into bioreactor systems on the edge of field applications to just enhance what can be taken up in those bioreactor systems.
Okay, and the next one, and you have some courses of biochar to share with a small farmer. And then it says they have wood zone.
What was that?
Can you have some courses of biochar to share with a small farmer?
Yeah, we figure out ways to work with small farmers on how to work with biochar on their site. And if it's training or whatever you need, we can figure it out. Or yeah, we have several farmers that we have worked with to figure out how they can do biochar on site.
Awesome. Okay, any other questions? Okay, well, if you need to reach out to Todd for any reason, his email and contact information are here on the screen. If you'd like to reach out to me or Great Lakes Biochar for any reason, if you have any questions, my email is here in the chat, glbn@msu.edu. And with that, if there's no other questions, we can all say big thank you to Todd for his presentation today. And we'll give you guys some time back in your Tuesday. All right. Thank you so much, Todd. It's great
Thank
having
you.
you.